Welcome back, everybody. I hope you're ready for a whole new era in the Bible. We get to jump into Exodus today. This is week 13 of Creative Come Follow Me for the Old Testament. We're covering from Exodus 1 to Exodus 6 today. It's the beginning of the deliverance story. We will end right before the plagues hit. So you're kind of getting all the hard and Moses' origin story, and we get right up to the brink of where the miracles start to unfold. So it's a good cliffhanger where you end up. We're covering a lot of ground, but it's not too much time. So this is where we left off. We had the brothers in Egypt because their whole family, all 70 of them, had moved down. Joseph passes away, Jacob passes away. This week you'll see that all the other brothers in that generation pass away. And we kind of see what happens to the children of Israel next. They grow, they multiply, they get strong, which makes this new Pharaoh nervous, and it impacts how they are treated in Egypt. So they go from being these treasured refugees who are taken care of by one king to feared, great big people who the next king treats very poorly. They're going to become slaves in the middle of things. And then they need deliverance. Because remember, they knew from the beginning that this was just a temporary place for them. They need to get back to the promised land. So that's kind of where Moses weaves into this story. He will be the deliverer. What you're going to love about Moses this week is he teaches us so much about the Savior's role. I think the Come Follow Me manual did a great job of emphasizing that this story of deliverance is about us. We are the children of Israel in this scenario who are in bondage, who need freedom and who crave it and who hope for it. And eventually it comes, but it takes time. So I love Moses' character for what it teaches me about the character of Christ. And what I loved is that the more I studied Moses, the more I felt like I learned about the Savior, and vice versa. In fact, I taught in my YSA Institute class all about the Savior because that's our whole focus for the whole semester. And it was amazing to me how much of Moses' story helped me with that lesson. I just found so many beautiful parallels. In fact, the Savior even mentions that himself. So this is in John chapter 5, verse 46, where he's talking to the Jews and saying, if you believed Moses, you'll believe me. If you didn't believe Moses, you won't believe me. They are in similitude. In fact, Moses is the only prophet in scripture where Jesus says, I am in similitude of him. Like people compare them both directions. So there's power in studying Moses. I know you felt like you probably knew him from that very beginning of this year, but you're going to love him even more as you jump into Exodus. So a few things you want to watch for, of course, are those different types and shadows of Christ. There are many, many of them. I'm not even going to take the time to lay them out here, but there's a bunch in the notes and there's more as you search. So watch for those. You also want to watch for women in the scriptures. This is a good week to focus on how the women impact this covenant story, because you get names and you get details that we don't get in other places. So this is a good week for that. I'm not going to walk you through all the different chapter summaries because I think the story is fairly familiar to you, but I just want you to get your notes, get your scriptures. I promise you're going to love this story more than you ever have before. At least I did. So hopefully that rubs off on you as well. Okay, let's get started. Exodus 1 is the beginning. We start to see what happens when you leave a big group of covenant people in a lush land that can produce well. They multiply. There are tons of them. And this new regime that comes in place. In fact, you see all the generation of Joseph passes away. That's in verse 6. And then in 7, you can see that there is a regime change. Now, you can go into the history and learn that this is actually the southern kingdom taking over the northern kingdom. I mean, they think. We're still kind of trying to piece together the timeline here. But this is not just, oh, there's a new son that isn't like his dad. This is a whole regime change. A different kind of king is coming into power, and he knew not Joseph, which means he's not going to take care of the children of Israel the same way previous kings had done. So you see how that plays out for the children of Israel. As they're growing, as they're multiplying, they get mightier and stronger, and the Pharaoh is worried. In fact, you can see in 9 that he talks about how he wants to get them out of the land. It was interesting to me because I had just heard a story on NPR yesterday about refugees coming from Ukraine into all these other countries, and they had a similar concern that so many millions of refugees were crossing over those borders that they were worried there would be too many that they would take over at some point. It was interesting to hear those parallels, but the Pharaoh is nervous. Interestingly, his solution is to make their life miserable. You would think he would just kick them out of the land, but they've kind of grown up here for at least 4 generations. They're kind of seeded into this place, and he has a strategy that I think is very much like what we see with Satan's strategies. He intends to make their life miserable so that he can weaken them as a people and then be able to kick them out. Because I don't know if he thinks he can actually take them over at this point in time. So you see that strategy kind of play out, which is a lot like what the adversary does. If he can't beat us, he's going to try to weaken us or divide us. And you'll see that a few times in this week's chapters. You also see that these children of Israel are made to be slaves, that they will do very intense outdoor work. Now, I've been to Egypt twice now, and there are times of day you don't even step outside, at least for us. Like, you stayed in the bus where the air conditioning was because you can't escape the heat. So this idea of them being out in the sun, building these treasuries or granaries that was their entire task, this brick making, is kind of a staggering thought. What is even more staggering is it doesn't seem to impact them the way Pharaoh thinks it will. So you see in 12 that the more they were afflicted, the more they multiplied. You almost wish that there was a verse, kind of like we get in the Book of Mormon, where it says like they couldn't feel the burdens on their back and they kept going. I don't know if that's what's happening here, or if it's just a matter of circumstance, but you can see that this is God's covenant people, and there's something to them that makes them resilient. And the Pharaoh sees that too, and it scares him. So he puts these taskmasters, which is basically kind of like a slave driver. It's somebody over a whole bunch of slaves to kind of make their lives harder. So he keeps trying to increase their effort. And he changes the law. So I think his motivation with this, the killing of infant boys, he comes and he has a theory that if he can just wipe out the infant boys, much like we see in Herod in the New Testament, that will change things. I don't know if he's heard the prophecy of Joseph where they know they'll be delivered by a man named Moses at some point, or if that's all completely new to him and he just thinks this will help assimilate things, right? If everyone is scared to have children, that population will die out, and all the girls who are left behind will eventually marry Egyptians because there's no Hebrew men to marry. So that's kind of, I wonder if that's his train of thought. And you see it play out, but there's this interruption that comes from these amazing midwives. So we kind of think, the scholars I read that sounded right to me, because there's a lot of opinion, but Shiphrah and Puah are the two Hebrew midwives who kind of have this civil disobedience moment where they go against Pharaoh. And one of the scholars I read said it's likely that they were over other midwives. It's not just these two midwives. They had a pact of some kind that they were going to defy Pharaoh's order, that they wouldn't kill the Hebrew boys. And so that's kind of what plays out. They have this bold act and they refuse, but they don't tell Pharaoh that. They don't say it to his face, which is an interesting diplomacy strategy, right? If they had defied him in that moment in Pharaoh's court, they wouldn't have been able to save those sons of the children of Israel. So instead, they have this alternate strategy. So as you flip your page, you'll see that in 17, the midwives feared God and they saved the men children alive. And then Pharaoh comes to them and says, why did you disobey me? And they have this great story where they basically say, oh no, it's that the Hebrew women actually are so lively that they have their babies before we even get there. So you see the way the Lord treats them as you go through the verses. I love the reaction from the Lord. When you look in 20 and 21, he made them houses. He dealt well with them. Again, I don't think it's just these two midwives. I think they represent many midwives who are putting their lives on the line to save the sons of Israel. And I just love that he made them houses, which means they have posterity. Lots of midwives in this time were women who were barren or who were unmarried. So to have this blessing of a house is bigger than just a structure. It is a line. It is a posterity, and that is an incredible blessing. But then you see Pharaoh pivot. That strategy didn't work. So then he has a new strategy that basically says, any son that's born, you need to cast into the river. So we're talking the Nile, right? This is a gigantic river that connects to the ocean, and it's full of crocodiles and hippos and all kinds of danger. So that's his new strategy, and we're going to see how Moses' family gets around it in chapter 2. One of the scholars I read this week said an interesting thing. He said you could basically split the book of Exodus into two parts. The first part is all about getting the Israelites out of Egypt. The second part, from like chapter 20 on, is about getting Egyptian tradition out of the Israelites. That idea of trying to get all these, at least hundreds of years of being in this land out of their hearts is a process. What I think is cool about what we saw in chapter 1 and also in chapter 2, actually you'll see it in all the chapters this week, is there are people whose hearts are already feeling that. We saw it with the midwives. Their hearts are turned to God. The way they face is to God. The way Jehoshaphat, Moses' mother, faces is also to God. I also think his father probably was. We often talk about the unnamed people of the scriptures. We know both of their names, but the narrative focuses on his mother's choice. And I absolutely admire it, and we'll talk about it. But I have no doubt that his father played an important role there as well. So we learn their names later. It's Jehoshaphat and Amram. They're both Levites. You see that in verse 1. They have this son, a goodly son, meaning he's healthy and attractive, and they try to harbor him. She tries to hold on to him for 3 months. I have a grandson that's almost 3 months old now. And so the idea of putting him in a basket just kind of tore my heart out this week. I don't know if it's because the ages were so similar, but you see it in verse 3. When she could no longer hide him, she took him an ark of bulrushes and daubed it with slime and pitch and put the child therein and laid it in the flags by the river's bank. Here's what I love about this piece of the story. I feel like this is Jehoshaphat's valley of vulnerability. We talked about that last week. This is her moment where she has to put everything she has on the altar. We know from revelation that comes in Hebrews, I can't remember which chapter, it's in the notes, that this choice was done by faith. They reference these two, this couple, and say by faith they chose to save Moses. That's not the right words, but that's kind of what the idea is. So I loved theorizing on how she came to this decision. Maybe she had a dream, or maybe her husband did. I don't know how that happened. Maybe they knew a little bit about the prophecies that had already been promised, that there would be a deliverer who would be raised by a daughter of a king. Maybe they were kind of piecing those things together. Or maybe this is her touch these stones moment. That's kind of where my heart leans. With the brother of Jared, where he had to come up with his own solution. He knew the Lord would help them. He just didn't know how the Lord was going to give them light. And the Lord doesn't answer him. He just kind of inspires him to get to work, come up with a creative solution. And to me, this ark is a creative solution. It is not what other people probably would have come up with. There's probably a whole bunch of other ways to hide a son or to send him out to live somewhere else. But she comes up with this solution and says, basically, touch these stones. When she puts him in this ark. It's the only other time we see this word used in Hebrew, other than the story of Noah. It's a rescue vessel, and it is designed to preserve life. She covers it with pitch, which is the same word they use with Noah's story. It's the same word that's used when you talk about the atonement. It's to cover, to help, to save. So you see her come up with this strategy and then stand on the river's brink and put him in. But what you have to love about this moment, to me, Jehoshaphat's moment right here is no less of a sacrifice than Abraham's was. I get that their circumstances are different, and Abraham had to wait a long time for his miracle, but maybe she did too. I don't know their story. So I just love that everything she has is in that basket. Her hope, not just for her son and her family, but the hope of bigger things is in that basket. And so she sends it off. But I love that she has a few backup strategies in place. One of them is his big sister. So Miriam is his big sister. We know that Aaron, you're going to learn about Aaron in the next chapter, but Aaron is 3 years older than Moses. And then we think Miriam is older than both of them. So we don't know exactly how much older, but she's old enough to at least be out on her own and near Pharaoh's court, because she's the one that follows the basket and watches it get into the daughter of Pharaoh's hands. And then she, of course, as an awesome young daughter, saves not just her brother, but the relationship between the brother and her mother. So Miriam, as you see, follows it along. And when the daughter of Pharaoh has compassion on the baby, it cries in this basket, and she says she's going to keep it. Miriam steps up and says, "Do you want me to find you a nursemaid?" Which was really common back then. And then the daughter of Pharaoh says yes. And so she, of course, grabs her mother and says, "I've got one right here." And in this culture, to have a nursemaid doesn't necessarily mean that Jehoshaphat would visit the palace now and then. It means that the son got to go back and live with his family for a few years. I'm sure they had visits, and I'm sure there was more happening there, but Jehoshaphat got to keep her son, at least for a few years, kind of like Hannah with Samuel. And I just love that parallel. I see it with Mary too, that she got to keep her son for a time, even though I think she knew, for sure Mary knew, but I don't know how much Jochebed knew, that he would eventually be for everyone. But for a time, he was just hers. And I just love that piece of the story. So he stays with her until he's weaned and then goes to the Pharaoh's court. I don't have time to go into it all, but the story is pretty familiar to you. So he sees the mistreatment of the children of Israel. Because remember, they've been slaves, aggressively treated outside in the hot sun, and he sees them being mistreated. As you go in the Institute manual, it says that one of the theories is that there was a Hebrew woman who was actually being assaulted by this guard, and that's why Moses steps in. But whatever the circumstances, Moses steps in when there's abuse happening and saves. So in this spot, he kills the Egyptian guard, which he thinks happens when no one is watching, but the next day he finds out that's not the case. So that's kind of around 11 and 12. 13 is when the next day he sees two children of Israel fighting almost, and he tries to intervene. Again, he's a Christ-like figure. He is a peacemaker and a mediator, and they turn on him. They basically say, who are you to judge us? Who put you over the rest of us? And they also implied that they saw what he did yesterday to the guard, and that puts him in hot water because now he's at risk. I think it's interesting to see Moses try to straddle these two worlds. He's not going to fit in with the Egyptians. I mean, even Pharaoh's daughter recognized him as a Hebrew as soon as she opened the basket. I don't know if that's because he's been circumcised or if they physically looked different. Regardless, Moses will never really fit in among the Egyptians. He also never really fits in among the children of Israel. They will always see him as a bit of an outsider, and that's going to cause some hurt. And I just think there's power in appreciating that, because most of us or our teenagers feel like this, like they're straddling two worlds and they don't fit anywhere. What I love about Moses' example is he looks up. That's where he finds peace. You don't get it quite in this chapter. Something has to happen in the middle, and that's what we're going to learn about next. So you'll see that because he's afraid that his father's the father of the daughter of Pharaoh. So the Pharaoh is going to take it out on him for creating this problem where he killed the guard. So he runs. He goes to Midian, which isn't close. We don't know exactly where Midian is, but it could even be like in the Sinai Peninsula, like way far. So he goes away for 40 years. Where he lands is not by happenstance. He lands among a people who have the priesthood. And so you'll see what happens. So as you go in like 16, he goes to Midian. He sees that there's 7 daughters, which I love because I have 6 big sisters. So this is 7 daughters who are out taking care by the well, taking care of the livestock. Again, Moses helps them just the same way we saw with the patriarchs, and he gets invited into this family. In fact, he's given one of those 7 daughters, Zipporah, as a wife. I love this piece of his story because it feels like a little bit of my story, or my parents' story. So when my parents converted to the church, they ended up being welcomed into the family of the missionary who converted them. So the Burnett family kind of welcomed our family in. Since they sort of had to cut ties with their own families to some degree, they were welcomed in. Like we went to Burnett reunions, even though we weren't blood relatives at all. And my parents had a season where they got to be with the Burnetts and learn their ways and soak in their goodness, and that blessed everybody else as we grew up. That's how I feel about Midian. This time where Moses gets to live with Jethro, who we know is a high priest in the Melchizedek priesthood. He's the one that will give the priesthood to Moses. He is a good man. He must be. And I think 40 years spending time with his family and all these daughters and all, like all this good, comfortable family who knows the covenant gives him a chance to catch up. Because I don't know how much he learned, probably very little in Pharaoh's court about the covenant and about his patriarchal ancestry. And I bet there was a lot of catching up to do. And I think that happened in Midian. So I just sort of love this little interlude because I feel like it sort of sets the stage for what happens in chapter 3. Remember when we studied Jacob and how he went to a certain place and that became Bethel? It's this temple-like experience for him. I feel like this chapter 3 moment, this burning bush, is kind of like that for Moses. It's the first recorded verses we have about Moses coming face to face with the Lord. In fact, you'll see in verse 2 that it says an angel of the Lord was by the burning bush, but we know from the footnotes from Joseph Smith that this actually is the Lord. He's face to face, much like we saw with all of his ancestors who have these epic moments of face-to-face interactions with the Lord. I also love what you see in verse 1. Moses is a keeper of the flock. In fact, that's why he's on this mountain, because in this area, keeping the flock means you actually travel with the flock to different places at different times of year so that they can have the green that they need. If you go on the Google Earth link I give you in the notes, like, this is not a lush land. It's amazing that there is a bush anywhere, because this, especially where we think Mount Sinai or Mount Horeb is, like, it's this great big red rock. Like, picture Zion's National Park. That's kind of what we're going with. So he goes and he sees an angel in this burning bush. Again, we don't know all of the story. This is the Bible. So as far as it's translated correctly, we know that this looked like a burning bush, but it was not consumed. That's in verse 2. You see it again in verse 3. I love that because I feel like it's so similar to what we studied in the Doctrine and Covenants with the first vision. In fact, one of the accounts, I can't remember, it's in the notes, I think it's the 1835 account, where he actually talks about how he was surprised that the woods around him didn't burn. It's not the one on the Pearl of Great Price, but you can find it on the church website. But I feel like that's what this is. So it's possible this bush is not just like a single bush. It could be an area. It could look a lot more like the first vision than we maybe give it credit for. But either way, it's a similar kind of experience. And so he's amazed that the bush isn't burnt. And I kind of love, we'll talk about the object lessons. I loved that piece of the story because I think the fact that he says it twice or recognizes it twice tells us something, that this is going to be a pattern that Moses is going to need to rely on later. There are going to be times in his life when his adversity will feel like a fire and he will feel like he is burning. And what the Lord is trying to say is, you're not going to be consumed. I know it's a fire. I know it looks bad. Trust me. No matter how bad it gets, you will not be consumed. I feel like Moses is the bush. I mean, not literally, but this is an object lesson that the Lord is teaching him right out of the get-go, so he can rely on it always, the same way he did with Joseph Smith. That's my take. But then again, I'm a bit of an object lesson girl, so I love it. Okay, so you'll see a few things. As you flip the page, you'll see he says the same thing that he says to Joseph. Moses, Moses. He calls him by name, and Moses says, here am I. Remember, he's had 40 years to live with Jethro, this high priest, to learn his ways, and he knows what to do in these moments. Well, I would assume. So he has learned, and he responds. And then he gets this interesting direction in verse 5. He's told to put off thy shoes. This is holy ground. Big things haven't happened there yet. Not that we know of. They probably have been, but there's no reason he would assume this is holy ground. What the Lord, I think, is saying is, get close. To me, it's remove all separation. What gets in the middle between you and holiness? There's been a few times in my life where I've walked into a place that I know is sacred and I expect like a big something to happen and nothing happens because I'm not prepared for it, or, there's lots of reasons why, or sometimes you'll go into a sacrament meeting where everybody else is like in tears and you don't feel anything. I think this idea of take off your shoes is when you see holiness around you, when you see a sacred situation happening and you don't quite feel it, you should take off your shoes. Now, literally, you should look for things that are maybe getting in the way. Maybe there's more you could study. Maybe you could pray more earnestly. Maybe when you go into the temple, you could bring names. Find a way to take off your shoes spiritually and get closer to the Lord. I love that direction that you see. So he does that. He steps in this holy ground and he learns about his connection to his Father in heaven. So I love that. First, in 6, you see the Lord tells him about his ancestors. These are your people. It's not just to tell him an ancestor story. It's to say, I saved them. I will save you. I have promised the same promise to all of them that I will deliver you because you have a work to do. So he gets that reminder at first. Then he talks about what I feel like verse 7 is a critical verse because it teaches us what to do when our bush is burning. When we're in the heat of adversity and we don't see the end, what can you do? He talks about how he has surely seen the affliction of his people. He has heard their cry. He knows their sorrows. Those 3 verbs to me are powerful. He's not taking any of the children of Egypt or children of Israel out of their situation yet. This whole time he's been watching. Just like we talked about with the apostles, or the disciples, I should say, when they're out on the water and it's the 4th watch moment, and he's been watching them that whole time struggle all through the night. He has seen it all. He knows all their afflictions. And I think that's what we have to remember when we're in a burning bush moment. that he is there. He sees, he hears, he knows, even if we're not being yanked out just yet. And then he talks about how he's also seen the oppression. This, I think, is important. This is in verse 9. I think it's important because there is a tie between the atonement of Jesus Christ and this idea of restitution, that he knows exactly the ills that have been caused to us, how much harm has been done, and the atonement can cover it. There's a beautiful BYU devotional. I think I linked to it last week in my stories. It's on the notes too, that talks about this principle of restitution. You don't want to miss it, but I don't have time to teach it here. So watch for that. And then he has this interesting direction. So around verse 10, he says, I will send thee unto Pharaoh. Remember, Moses is a shepherd. He's been off away from Egypt for 40 years. And all of a sudden he has this great big call. So of course his response in 11 is, who am I that I should go unto Pharaoh? And I love the Lord's response. I will be with thee. In fact, certainly I will be with thee. That's in 12. And then he helps him understand how. What I thought was powerful about that is there are many times in my life when I am afraid or I feel ridiculously inadequate or underprepared for something. And if I fixate on my weakness, it feels overwhelming. So in these circumstances, what the Lord is saying, instead of focusing on yourself, focus on me. How big am I? How much can I handle? How much can I do? This is when you look back on all those ancestor stories of the patriarchs that we've studied and realize, okay, they weren't perfect either and they got help. So I love that he's trying to give him that direction. He's helping him understand, stop thinking about yourself, focus on me. What can I multiply? What can I do? And build confidence in that. You go a little bit farther and you see he teaches him about his name. The name Jehovah, which is the name that we give to the premortal Jesus Christ. So before he comes to earth to live his mortal ministry, he is known as Jehovah. In fact, Adam knew him as Jehovah and all the patriarchs since. So he teaches him that critical name. And there's all sorts of good stuff in the notes if you want to learn more about Yahweh and why that is such a sacred name. But as you go a little bit further, he talks about that he has sent him. I love that phrase. It's in the middle of 15. He has sent me unto you. This is my name forever. This Jehovah's mission and purpose stretches far beyond what Moses can see. In fact, we know this burning bush moment happens before what we studied at the very beginning of this year. So remember when we studied when Moses comes head to head with the adversary and then, he has those moments where he sees all things. That happens after this. So sometime between the Red Sea and the burning bush is Moses 1 through 6. So you kind of see him setting the stage for that in these. But I love the way he helps Moses come to terms with his inadequacies. In 13, Moses is scared, right? He doesn't know how he's going to talk to the children of Israel and get them to trust him. He hasn't been around them for all this time, and he's worried about it. So the name offering is kind of the Lord's way of saying, give them the name. Those who are righteous will recognize that name and know that you are sent from me. And so he tries to kind of reassure him that I think there is power in the name of Jesus Christ. If you've been to the temple, you know that there's weight there and a spirit there that is powerful. So first he gives them that tool. Later he's going to give them some signs as well. But he assures them in 18, he assures Moses that they're going to hearken. They're going to hear you. And then he tells him he's going to go to the king of Egypt and that the king of Egypt won't want to hear him. So he's supposed to go to the king, which I'm sure he felt completely inadequate to do and maybe even a little afraid to do because the last time he left, his life was on the line. But that's what he's supposed to do. He's supposed to go to the Pharaoh and say, the children of Israel need 3 days to worship. Please let them go for 3 days. And he kind of makes it clear that Pharaoh's not going to come around. He's not going to like it. He's sort of playing this out for Moses so that none of this is a surprise. And then he tells them that he'll bring signs and wonders and that eventually the children of Israel will leave this land with their pockets full. These jewels that they'll gather, we'll learn a little bit about this next week, but they'll become the adornments of the tabernacle. So it's not like he's trying to line their pockets with gold. It's all about preparing for what comes next. But that kind of takes you to the end of chapter 3. Moses is still worried, so the Lord gives him some signs. I don't even know that it's a lack of faith on Moses' part. I just think he's working through his fears. And what I love about this interaction with the Lord is the Lord seems to understand that. He doesn't reprimand Moses in this moment. He says, okay, I know your word, they're not going to believe you. Take that rod that's in your hand, throw it on the ground, it's going to become a snake. And then once it is a snake and Moses is afraid, he commands him to take the snake by the tail and it becomes a rod again. It's this sign that he can then use to help the children of Israel understand that he is God's servant. There's a lot you can study in the notes about this, but I sort of loved this understanding that the Lord has. He doesn't discount our fear. In fact, oftentimes he helps us. Michael Wilcox calls this, we worship a fleece-giving God. You'll learn all about that later in the Old Testament, but I think the Lord oftentimes understands our fear and says, let me help. And he gives him alternatives. He gives him extra support. If the snake part doesn't work, he gives him another one. This is if he puts his hand to his breast, it turns into a leprous hand, and then he does it again and it turns, clean again. So he's showing him that the magic isn't in the stick, right? Because if it was just the rod, if you could just show a sign with the rod, people would assume they should worship the rod itself. Or if you didn't have the rod, maybe there's nothing to you. And this is the Lord saying, it's part of you, Moses. This priesthood that you carry, the power comes from that, not from the things. And so you see that with the leprosy. Then he gives him one more. This is kind of a foreshadowing of what happens in the plagues, but he's able to dump water from the Nile on dry ground and it will turn into blood. So these three signs that he can use to help convince the children of Israel are designed to give him those options. The first and preferred choice is that he says the name of Jehovah and that those who are righteous will recognize it, feel the Spirit, and know. If they're not to that point, then he gives them all these other ways to connect with the children of Israel, which I just thought was powerful. I think there's so much grace and mercy in this. These children of Israel have been slaves. They've been away from their covenant for a long time. We don't know what remnants were left of what the patriarchs passed down. And he understands that. So he's giving them a way to know him in lots of different avenues. Then you go a little bit further and you see Moses' fears. So we got a little bit of this when we studied Moses in the Pearl of Great Price, but you see him be afraid. So he says in 10, I am not eloquent. Despite all these signs, I'm not going to be able to get my words right. He's afraid. We learn later from Joseph Smith's translation that this might even be an actual speech impediment, a stammering of some kind. So if you're already nervous and you're facing a pharaoh or a big group of people who are slaves and are angry, you would imagine the stammer might get worse. He is afraid. I'm slow of speech. And then you see the Lord's response. Who hath made man's mouth? That's in verse 11. To me, when I read that, I take it the same way you see it in the Book of Mormon in Ether, that God gives weaknesses for a purpose, that we can be made strong. In fact, one of my favorite ways that God makes weaknesses into strengths is by creating contrast. I talk about this in my Time Out for Women talk too, but I love the idea of he chooses weak servants on purpose because the contrast is what draws your eye. When I studied art all through school, we worked a lot on contrast, highs and lows, so that they bounce off each other in a painting. That's what we're creating here. He's creating contrast, which turns this weakness into a strength. You see it with Joseph Smith as well. But it's going to take a while for Moses to get fully on board. But I love the idea of it, that he's basically saying, I understand your fears. You can do this. It's a confidence building. If you go in the notes, you can find lots more quotes about it. So he reminds him of that. Then when Moses still is afraid and still turns to the Lord in fear, he gives him Aaron as a spokesman. So that's his big brother, 3 years older, kind of like Joseph and Hiram. They will be together like those two brothers most of the time. And in this case, Aaron's going to be his spokesman. What's interesting to me is as you go through the verses, it's very clear that Moses is still the prophet, that Aaron is there to be a spokesman, but he is saying the words that God says to Moses. And God makes that very clear to Moses. I actually think that's why when you get all the way to Acts, when the New Testament apostles are speaking about Moses, they speak about him being a man who was confident in his words. That's not the words they use, but they talk about how he's well-educated and well-spoken. So I think he actually comes into his own, much the same way we saw with Joseph Smith. In Kirtland, he was a bit shaky. He was diligent, but shaky, and often needed a spokesman. Sidney Rigdon did that a lot. And then by the time we get to Nauvoo, you see Joseph Smith kind of step into this role, and he doesn't use a spokesman as much anymore. And you get powerful sermons that you didn't quite see. There's a progression, and I loved watching that progression. You'll see that with Moses too. So Moses gets up the gumption to trust and to go. This is his big moment, right? He takes his rod and he goes. That's in 17. He goes to his father-in-law, says, let me go. And of course, as a high priest in the Melchizedek priesthood, he says, Lord wants you where? Okay. Off he goes. And then you get this interaction that we don't fully understand. Before you get into the part with Zipporah, you see the Lord calling his children. He's saying the children of Israel are under a covenant. This is how I take it. Basically, he calls them his firstborn, meaning God's firstborn people who have a covenant to take the gospel to all the world, to take these saving ordinances to all the world. They can't do that if they're enslaved. So he needs them liberated so that this work can roll forward. And that's kind of what you'll see there. Then you see the interaction with Zipporah, where Moses, for whatever reason, and we don't know what the reason is, has not circumcised their son. And so Zipporah steps in and circumcises him with a sharp stone. Remember that Moses didn't grow up in the covenant, or he didn't understand those things the way Zipporah would have, right? She had a high priest father. So I wonder if there was he's almost like a convert husband that she is helping. And again, he's been here 40 years and I don't know why, but for whatever reason, she steps in and helps. I imagine there was some tension there about all of it. But in this process, Zipporah goes back home with Jethro. They're going to get reunited later. She takes the kids home and he goes off to Egypt. I don't think they're in hostility towards each other. I just think this is a way to keep them safe. So Zipporah and the two sons stay with Jethro, and Moses and Aaron go off to try and fulfill this epic mission. I think one of the ways you see how choosing weaker servants who will become strong pays off for the Lord is that they do exactly what he says. So when Moses and Aaron get to Pharaoh, they don't sugarcoat anything. They don't bring him lots of gifts as far as we can tell. They just say, let my people go, that they can go in the wilderness and worship. And of course, Pharaoh doesn't comply. In fact, so much so that he makes everybody's lives harder. But before you can jump into that, you have to see verse 2. So I love verse 2 when he says, who is the Lord that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? I think that is a pivotal question. I think it's very similar to what we see with Pilate in the New Testament, where he has an opportunity to save the Savior and instead kind of puts him out to the people. The verse in Matthew is kind of similar, where he says, who is this Jesus? It's this, I think all of us come to points in our life where we get a chance to encounter goodness, especially opportunities to encounter a testimony of the Savior. And we have to choose if we will be like Pharaoh or if we will be more like King Lamoni's father in the Book of Mormon, who is in the same position of power and chooses to lean in and learn more and say, I'll give up all my sins to know thee. That's this moment for Pharaoh. And he chooses to be like Pilate, basically, and wash his hands. And it turns out really badly for Pharaoh. Everything goes wrong. But first it goes wrong for the children of Israel. So you see in that next column that he decides you can't have straw anymore to make your bricks. You're going to have to gather it yourself. And the quotas are not going down. I don't have time to go into all of it, but it becomes a ridiculously hard burden. They're gathering scraps of everything they can find. One of the scholars I said they used hair and sticks, but none of those things were good binding agents. So the bricks fell apart. And what would happen is the officers would get beaten. So you have the taskmasters, which are over the bigger groups. And then under those, you have smaller groups of slaves, and they're ruled by officers, which generally it sounds like were among the Hebrews. So they're kind of one of their own. And they are beaten when the quotas aren't up to par. And so it's hard. I mean, I just picture Moses and Aaron, who are still in this land, watching this play out. And it's a lot like Alma and Amulek in the Book of Mormon, when they watch all those converts get sacrificed, women and children thrown into the fire, and they have to watch it all. I don't know how long this plays out, but I imagine that was brutal to watch. And so the slaves, of course, question why. They go to Pharaoh, they wonder why this is happening. Pharaoh basically says, it's not me, it's because of Aaron and Moses. That's kind of his response. It's the fault is in thine own people. That's in verse 16. And then you get a little bit further and you see Moses's pain. This is his Liberty Jail time. I love that Moses and Aaron are in this together, the same way Joseph and Hiram were in Liberty together. If you look in the footnotes, it actually links to Liberty, because he is devastated at what's happening to this people. And he says in 22, why is it thou hast sent me? It's, oh God, where art thou? And then he says in 23 that basically you haven't delivered this people at all. You promised and you haven't delivered, and he is struggling, and you just can't. You have to sink into those verses because it helps you understand what happens next. In Exodus 6, we see the Lord's answer. And to me, it echoes the Book of Mormon. Remember in 3rd Nephi, when Nephi, at that time, he's waiting for the sign to happen. They're waiting for the sun not to set. And people are, the next day, they're going to all be killed if it doesn't happen. That's where they're at. They are poised for pain, and the Lord swoops in. It is the 4th watch. And so he says in verse 1, "Then the Lord said unto Moses, now thou shalt see." What I love about this is those key verses. He says now, meaning finally it's time, and also shalt thou see. He says, to me, I take this as God has been delivering all this time. I know the children of Israel can't feel it yet, but he's helping them bond. They have a common enemy now. They're going to be able to leave Egypt because of their hatred for this interaction they've had with the Pharaoh. He's creating a tightness within them. He's been delivering them all this time. They just couldn't see it. And neither could Moses. So now the Lord is saying, now your eyes will see it. I've seen it all along. Now you'll see. Because this is when they actually start to be delivered. Things start moving at a much more rapid pace, at least according to mortal eyes. And I just love that piece, because I think there's a lot of times when we're in our Liberty Jail moments and you can't see the end. You trust that he hears you. You trust that he sees you. All those things we learned back in verse 7. But you can't see his deliverance. And then you'll get to a point when the 4th watch is up and he will rescue and he will save. And that's where they are. So he reminds them again of who he is. I am Jehovah. I am thy God. I am thy Lord. He makes it really clear that they are his people. In fact, if you look from like 5 through 7, you see this. It's almost poetic, the way the Lord teaches Moses about who they are, that he's heard them. He remembers their covenant. In 6, I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. Again, you can apply that to whatever your burdens are, but there is a 4th watch moment when he rescues, and you get that here. And in 7, I will take you to me. This is very, okay, I'm going to reach your reaching. I'm going to bring you to me. And ye shall know that I am. That's also in 7. They're going to come to know him in a whole new way. It's a way that their ancestors knew him, but things have been lost. And so now it's going to come full circle. And I love it. To me, it sounds a lot like what Joseph said to his brothers when he saved them in Egypt. He said, I will nourish thee. I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to feed you. I'm going to clothe you. I'm going to take care of your children. That's what the Lord is promising. For whatever reason, now is the time, and it's time for the deliverance to happen. What I think is so cool about this is none of these people have been perfect. They've murmured and been grumpy and had hard things. Moses himself doubted the Lord to some extent and said, where are you? Why haven't you delivered them at all? They weren't perfect people, but the Lord swoops in to save. And I just love that. So then he teaches them a little bit more about what happens. Moses is directed to go tell the people. They don't even listen to him this time. He's lost all credibility. And honestly, I think they are just devoid of hope. I think they're in a despair moment. And despair is a tool of the adversary. And you can see that sinking in verse 9. And so then he has to go speak to Pharaoh. And of course, Moses is like, I can't even get my own people to listen. How will I get the king of Egypt to listen to me? But again, the Lord is trying to say, stop focusing on what you bring to the table. Who is your ally? You're bringing me with you. I promised you that certainly I will be with you. So he's reminding him of that. You're also going to see in the middle of 6, the genealogy of Moses. We know from Abraham's prophecies that it was going to be 4 generations before this deliverer was born. So that's kind of what you're going to see. I'm not going to go into those verses, but that's what you see in those verses is those 4 generations laid out. And then it wraps back up at the very end of chapter 6, kind of recapping those verses, saying this is Moses and Aaron, this is who they came from, and this is the moment where we're at, where he's wondering how Pharaoh will ever hearkened him. I think what I love, and I'll end on this is in verse 13. He hears all their worries. He hears all Moses' insecurities, and he says, and the Lord spake unto Moses and unto Aaron, and gave them a charge. To me, this is like a parent being like, I heard everything you're saying. Go. Do you remember President Hinckley when he spoke about his mission in Great Britain, I think, and he had wrote back all this list of hard things that were happening to his dad and said, not sure what the point of me being here is. And his dad wrote back this tiny little sentence that said, forget yourself and go to work. And that's it. Love your Father. That's what the Lord is saying. Forget yourself. Go to work. There is a deliverance to happen, and I will certainly be with thee. And that's where we end this week. So guess what happens next week? Deliverance will come. So we'll get into that next week.